We have Rich up next.
I love you, Rich!
Y'all can ask me to switch the order mid-set, but you might never get to play then because I'm a space cadet, so, good luck. Or come remind me.
All right, well, hello, everyone. As, I think a lot of you know, my name is Richard Naviaski, and a lot of you know I was a fireman in New York City, and today's 9/11, and I was 7 months on the job when 9/11 happened, and for me, 9/11, it's like one of those days that everybody knows about, of course, but it's kind of like unreal for a lot. Everybody is affected by it, but they don't really, I guess, have an insight into the reality of it. So I have this thing that I wrote a number of years ago. I always used to write in like August, because I'd get real heavy in August. I wouldn't really realize it was happening, but it would always kind of hit me. And then, so I started writing down my memories. And anyway, so I wrote this kind of account of my own kind of personal experience there. And I'm going to read it for you guys. So I've never read it out loud, so I don't know how my voice is going to do on this, but I'm going to hopefully, maintain my emotions. So, thank you. All right, so here I go. My experiences with 9/11 are just mine, a single person's in awful company with countless others. We all bore witness to the sickening level of destruction, of hate-fueled violence that humankind has the capacity for. Never forget. It was a mantra then. We can put it aside, but we can never forget. We are all irreparably damaged. On September 11th, 2001, I was off duty, but drove to the firehouse when I saw on my television that airplanes had hit the Twin Towers. It was a short drive, and for part of it, the unbelievable sight of the smoking Twin Towers was visible through my car's back window. I was in the firehouse kitchen when the first tower fell, and I remember how the bustling activity froze. We stared at the television, watched thousands of lives lost in those few seconds. We all knew that guys from our firehouse had responded to Lower Manhattan as soon as the first tower was hit, and then our urgent motion resumed. We continued gathering tools, and someone stopped a bus on the avenue, clearing it of passengers so it could be used as a transport down to the collapse. You couldn't pass a television without staring. I had stopped at the house watch and was staring at the TV when the second tower fell. I remember Lieutenant K walking by and me pointing and him saying it's a replay. I kept pointing, but it says live. We went back to loading up the bus, and minutes later we were on our way down to Ground Zero. We split into groups when we got to the West Side Highway near Stuyvesant High School. Names were being put onto riding lists. There were so many rumors, some of them true. The White House, the Pentagon, the Capitol building, all had been hit. The mayor was dead, along with the chief of department, the commissioner, and the union president. 40,000 lives were lost, maybe more. These were all the rumors that we were hearing. Some of them are true, some of them weren't. There were chiefs in the street keeping order. No one's going in until we have riding lists. We already don't know who's missing. I saw some guys from my probie class, white with dust and haunted by shock. A friend from my squad told me that jumpers had kept his company from entering the building. He told me he saw a jumper kill a fireman, and then a truck extended its aerial ladder horizontally for cover, and a jumper bent it to the ground. When the first tower collapsed, my friend ran into a parking garage. Everyone in front of him survived, he said, and everyone behind him disappeared. We waited there on the West Side Highway until a chief wrote my name on a list with Captain C, Lieutenant K, Tony, and Brian. Then we stripped hose and hooks off of rigs and left the beautiful blue sky, walking into the gray storm that was Lower Manhattan. The air was dark with dust and ash all day and night in there, the sky completely blocked out. Everything was so surreal inside that hell zone. We had walked into a blizzard of ash, burning papers floating on the air, and even though I knew that countless people had died, the enormity wasn't sinking in. Sometime that afternoon, as the group I was with was taking a temporary refuge from the collapse of Building 7 in a dust-filled fast food restaurant, I saw some guys from my probie class. We greeted each other, and one of them said, "I'm sorry about Tierney." That was when the horrible truth sank into my gut. I can remember the rush of blood in my ears. I asked him what he meant, and he told me John was listed as missing. And since John had worked at Ladder 9 in Manhattan, if he was missing, at that moment, as I stood with these guys, John was probably dead. John Tierney, my true-hearted friend. He was so naturally happy and genuinely fucking nice and always funny and quick to laugh and so goddamn full of life. So goddamn fucking full of life. My friend John Tierney, the closest I'd made in the academy. My lifelong friend had he only survived, but he died when he was 27 years old. The World Trade Center building that was across the street from the Millennium Hotel had heavy fire blowing from every window of every floor. We were sent into the hotel to search, and if we found any pockets of fire, to hook up our hose lengths to the standpipe and put the fire out. We did our search, found no fire, and the decision was made to leave the empty hotel. First we checked phones, lifting dead receivers, until by luck we found one with a dial tone. Then before leaving the hotel, we each made a short call to reassure our families. I can remember my mom's voice, her desperate relief at hearing me on the other end. Rich? Sometime that night, I was climbing across the jagged landscape of what had once been those two iconic buildings in a fog of smoke and dust. I was with Lieutenant K, one scavenged SCBA mask between us. That's what the mask that we wear on our backs. A cylinder of fresh air, which we hesitated to use, not wanting to lose the limited amount inside. We were following a path, if you could call it that, toward two trapped Port Authority police officers, repeating back calls for equipment, then passing these pieces of equipment forward as they came to us. Saws, blades, batteries, water bottles. A charged hose line was brought forward, the nozzle passing us, and then fire cut us off. At least that's the way it felt to me. In my mind, we were trapped, all of us ahead of this fire that had suddenly risen through the surface. I tried to stay calm, my mind flashing with panic, the voice in my head telling me we're all going to die. My lieutenant sent me forward to get the nozzle, and I rushed ahead across the mountain of destruction, calling for it. These guys at the nozzle, already sick from exhaustion and whatever we were breathing, helped bring back the hose line before stumbling their way forward again. I remember thinking how hard it was to hold onto the hose, knocking down these little bits of fire emerging everywhere. And in reality, I was probably having little or no effect whatsoever, but in my inexperience, I felt like this hose was everything. I felt like it was keeping us alive. Eventually, we passed the hose off and moved further across the destruction. When the first of the two Port Authority cops was finally freed, he was laid into a basket and passed along the line of firefighters. I was standing with Lieutenant K in a valley of debris when the basket came to us. Our hands joined in the procession, taking hold and helping to push it up the slope. I saw his legs turned unnaturally, both broken, and his face calm after being so long in this painful ordeal. We didn't know at the time that these two trapped Port Authority cops would be among the last people to come out alive. For days and even weeks, we kept waiting for news of survivors, hoping someone would be found alive and avoid of the collapse. We needed it, but it never happened. Late that night, back at the firehouse, I was lying on a couch trying to sleep, surrounded by guys at least as fatigued, both physically and mentally, as I was myself. I can remember closing my eyes and seeing burning buildings. I can remember laying there thinking about how death had come so suddenly to so many. Off and on, I must have slept. I can remember waking in the dark to the sound of someone weeping. In the 12 or so hours I was at Ground Zero that first day, I didn't see a single dead body. I saw destruction beyond belief, was surrounded by thousands of lost lives, but saw no bodies. Maybe it was because the air was so blinding, so full of that blinding WTC dust, and everything was so thickly covered by it. I can remember blinking my eyes madly, trying to keep them open, but unable for minutes at a time. My eyes, scratched by the dust of those pulverized buildings, burned for weeks afterwards, and I coughed for months. At the beginning, the fire department went to a schedule of 24 hours working, then 48 hours off. Every morning, a vehicle from our firehouse would go down to the site, bringing off-duty firefighters to search among the wreckage. For a while, it was an ambulance at our disposal, and guys would stuff into the back for the ride to Ground Zero. The regular schedule I made for myself was working 24 hours in the firehouse, then going with the vehicle to spend 6 or 8 hours at the pile. The next day, more likely than not, I would go to a funeral, sometimes two. I remember sitting at red lights in my car, and out of nowhere, I'd start to cry. I would snap myself out of it, or the light would change, and I would go back to driving. When you paused too long, it was just so easy to be overcome. A couple days after 9/11, my first day back at the site, I remember seeing a bunch of firemen start digging and scraping at one area on the smoking pile of flattened debris, so I jumped in and started digging and scraping too. I was on my knees working frantically, not sure exactly what had caused this flurry of motion, until I noticed right next to my knee a bare foot sticking through the gray surface. I remember saying to Billy, "Is that a foot?" and him saying, "Absolutely." We worked at that spot all day, and the work continued after we left. What we'd found was a river of crushed bodies through the flattened debris. People in New York nodded greetings to total strangers on the subway. There were walls of missing person signs everywhere. People brought food and flowers to firehouses and police precincts daily. School classes brought stacks of thank you cards. The West Side Highway was lined with people cheering for the workers who drove the road into Ground Zero. I took a taxi one day when I was off duty. I was wearing a fire department sweatshirt and the taxi driver wouldn't let me pay. Days after September 11th, I was assigned with a group of 4 guys to search a building at West and Liberty Street, which was around 25 stories high and surrounded top to bottom with scaffolding. The chief who gave us the assignment had gotten a report that there were bodies in the scaffolding, so he sent us in with some body bags. We went to the stairway and climbed to the roof. I remember being with Lieutenant C, who I had met a few times before, and a couple other guys I didn't know at all. On the roof, we began right away finding pieces of airplane and pieces of bodies. I was the one with the Proby patch on my helmet. The Proby patch is just like a patch that you wear for the first year. They show, so everyone knows you're new on the job. And okay, I was the one with the Proby patch on my helmet, so I was the one sent down to report to the chief what we were finding, and then back up through that dark crypt of a building to find my guys. I was handed a body bag that had something in it. Not a whole body, but substantial enough to bump my leg with every step I took. I carried it from floor to floor and everywhere we went. There was a smell of rotting death coming through the bag, and the bump of it hitting my leg was maddening. It was such a horrible feeling. I would try to hold it away from my body as I walked, but then it would bump the wall, and that was somehow just as bad. The body pieces littering the scaffolding were mostly chunks of flesh, many of them no bigger than a fist, but I also remember a footless leg hung up in the metal framework, and I remember seeing what appeared to be a spine. In the building, we had found black permanent markers, and we used these to mark body part or airplane part with the date and an arrow on the wall next to the windows. I don't remember how long this assignment lasted, but when we finally got to the temporary morgue on the World Trade Center site, I couldn't look away as the medical examiner opened the body bag that I had been carrying for so long. Inside was an armless torso already crawling with maggots. That was what had been bumping on my leg. I was working one day as part of a bucket brigade on top of the pile. At the front of the line, saws and torches cut through wood and metal and plastic. Rebar cutters broke rebar, and buckets of dust and debris, chunks of concrete, wedges of steel were passed back person to person to clear it all away. We were dismantling this enormous pile piece by piece. I was working my way closer to the front when a group of us saw a narrow crevice, a steep hill of crushed debris down to the tight mouth of a cave. I left the bucket brigade with several other firefighters and moved carefully into the crevice. We squeezed through the mouth of the cave at the bottom and found ourselves in a hallway and storage room of a Gap store. I remember stacked bras covered in thick dust and spray-painted messages on the wall letting us know that this area had been searched. Eventually, they fitted us each for filtered masks and gave us a card that told us the proper mask size we'd be provided whenever we entered Ground Zero. But before that, we would just wear whatever mask we could find. A few weeks after September 11th, I was wearing one that was painfully crushing my nose. This day, I was part of a group working side by side with a construction excavator somewhere on the pile. The excavator would grab a bucket full of debris in its metal jaws and lay the load on a flat area for us to sift through. We would remove any big pieces and search the rest of the pulverized mess with rakes and shovels, looking for clothing, bodies, bones, anything that had once been part of a human being. As the excavator lifted one of the many loads, a fireman shouted, "Stop." Then we all saw hanging from the bottom of the bucket's jaws a pair of bunker boots. I remember a line of thick, dark blood running slowly down each boot and dripping from the toes. Somehow the operator of the excavator laid the fireman perfectly on his back, miraculously keeping the rest of the bucket's debris from covering his body. He was mostly intact, though his belly had been torn open by the excavator and his guts now spilled onto the ground beside him. We searched him, trying to find anything that could tell us his identity. There was a gold chain on his neck, and at the time I wore my own gold chain with a replica of my badge, so I checked, hoping his chain would hold a similar medallion with the badge number. But his was a non-identifying pendant, a symbol of a Taurus. I remember his neck being green, and I remember trying not to look at his face, and I remember being unable to stop my eyes. And I remember that his face didn't look real. As the fireman was placed into a body bag, his identity remaining anonymous, I was the one with the shovel that scooped in his spilling intestines, and all along I was coughing and gagging from the horrible smell, telling myself that no matter what, I would not puke. When I said to one of the other firefighters afterwards, "It's incredible how much you can smell even while you're wearing the mask," he said, "You shouldn't smell anything." Then looking at me more closely, he said, "There's 2 huge gaps on either side of your nose." The mask, too small of a size, was doing nothing at all except hurting my face. Lieutenant D was one of the 7 firefighters who had been killed from my firehouse. When the door buzzed a couple weeks after September 11th, I opened it and froze, my brain trying to understand this ghost in front of me. There stood Lieutenant D. His body had not been found, and for those few seconds staring at him, my brain began to reason that maybe he'd been alive all along, hospitalized and unidentified. I stood frozen in the shock of that long moment, and then in a rush of excited relief, I said, "Hey," but it wasn't Lieutenant D. The man who shook my hand, the man who looked so much like him, reached out a hand and introduced himself as Lieutenant D's brother. The NFL called off all the games on the Sunday and Monday that followed September 11th. The schedule resumed the week after that. Then on October 1st, the Jets hosted the 49ers for Monday Night Football. There was going to be a halftime tribute with a donation presented to first responders, with 15 NYPD, 15 PAPD, and 15 FDNY members present. One of the guys from our firehouse had a brother who worked for the Jets, so the 15 FDNY members came from our firehouse, and I was one of them. We took a bus, drank some beers, and when our time came, we were ushered into the concrete tunnel where the players would make their entrance onto the field. I can remember these huge football players from both teams walking through the tunnel where we lined the walls and bowing their heads as they shook our hands, thanking us, telling us how sorry they were. These incredible athletes, these giant men, these gridiron superstars, they were all so humbled at that moment. We were led onto the field in front of a packed stadium, and the place went absolutely crazy. Every seat had someone screaming, whistling, clapping their hands. They were cheering so loud and waving little American flags. It was an unbelievable feeling being in the center of that. And then at halftime, we were led again back out to an equal applause where we were presented a donation check from players that included Vinny Testaverde and Curtis Martin. The stadium was going completely wild for us. I got calls later from my family and friends I grew up with back in Baltimore. "We saw you on TV. It was 3 weeks after 9/11, and at that time we were drowning, all of us." Since the attack, there had not been a break from the awful, overwhelming sadness. I know it's strange, but that superstar reception, it filled my heart. It gave me a feeling of pride in the midst of that horrible time. I remember someone saying it was the biggest crane in the world, and had been delivered in pieces from somewhere in the Midwest to be used in the effort to clean up the World Trade Center disaster. One day I was working with a group that was taken up in a man bucket, lifted by this crane high above the debris field. I remember being completely awestruck by the destruction, and even though I'd already been walking so many times through it, seeing the site from above was a stark new perspective. Below me was a purposeful man-made disaster. It looked like a giant meteor had crushed a piece of the city. When Flight 587 went down in the Rockaways 2 months after September 11th, my company was assigned to the crash site the following morning. The bodies were gone by then, but there were still body parts in the wreckage. I remember pulling a femur from the debris, muscle and skin still attached, and talking with some of the guys, saying how something so gruesome and horrible didn't seem to be having the effect on us that it should. I was sick with the flu sometime in October or November and went to work with high fever and all, feeling that if I took sick time for a simple flu, the ghosts of all those people who should have been alive, all those bodies still somewhere in that destruction, would look at me with disappointment. The flu was nothing next to that. I remember being so weak when Christian Regenhard had his funeral. It was in St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan. Christian was in my probie class, and outside St. Patrick's, I found other guys from our class. We lined the street in our Class A uniforms, the chill in the air making me shiver so hard. Then inside St. Pat's, where it was warm, I remember still shivering and sweating with my fever, but the funeral was beautiful and heart-wrenching, and I was glad that I went. I hadn't known Christian very well, but after the funeral, I was left with such a feeling of sadness. Here was a kind-hearted man, once an elite soldier, a beautiful poet, briefly a fireman, influential just through the act of being himself. The world had already benefited so much from his life, and there was so much more he could have given. It is such a terrible crime that this man's life was taken before he even reached the age of 30. I saw the families fairly often at the firehouse and memorials and funerals. They knew me as the probie, the guy who had gotten on the job shortly before this horrible thing happened. It was Thanksgiving in the firehouse when one of the wives asked me, "How do you like the job now?" I said, "Well, I love the job." Her voice became angry. "How can you love something that doesn't love you back? I wish I could talk to my husband again. I wish I could ask him, are you happy now?" There were several sections of huge steel frameworks that remained standing after the collapse of the Twin Towers, each somewhere around 6 stories tall or more. On the day that the last of these enormous steel skeletons was scheduled to be brought down, I was working at the World Trade Center site. The pile was gone, but had not yet become the pit. Everything at this time was more or less ground level. It was around 11 o'clock, and the giant framework was scheduled to come down at 1, so the area was being cleared of workers. I was standing with a bunch of firemen at the West Side Highway, just off the edge of the debris zone. I remember I was facing away when a guy in front of me pointed over my shoulder and screamed, "Look, look, 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 look." I turned and saw this giant steel skeleton come crashing down with the ground-shaking boom. All those guys that were still on the debris, and miraculously no one was hurt. Cameras were set up in buildings on the fringe, overlooking the field of destruction. I don't remember when or why, but I was given an assignment at one of these cameras. I don't remember my assignment. I might have been there for hours or for minutes. I don't remember how long. It was dark everywhere in the building except for where a string of construction lights led to the camera and monitor. What I can always remember, is the stench of human decay that was coming out from that darkness behind those construction lights. And I remember being in that building alone, wondering, should I go into that darkness to search for the source of the smell? Could I really be the first one in this building to smell death's presence? I didn't want to go into that dark alone and find something because, I'll say it, I was scared. It was obvious that death was here, somewhere close, but death was everywhere. And the recovery effort at the World Trade Center site was so meticulous that I knew this building was waiting its turn to be searched thoroughly. Until then, the remains of these murdered people would stay buried in that haunted darkness. At the memorial service for John Tierney, everyone from our academy squad was there. I can remember walking toward one of my good friends and seeing his eyes get red, fighting back tears. I was numb. I'd loved John, truly. John to me was a simple definition of good. He was goofy and funny, naturally happy. He'd call me on the phone just to play a sloppy rendition of a Dylan song that he'd figured out on guitar. He was John Tierney, a one-of-a-kind, my true fast friend. When I saw his mother's face, John's mother's face, my heart broke, the numbness ending suddenly, and finally I had to turn away, finally had to hide my own tears. Sometime later, I was talking to Mrs. Tierney, and I told her how great her son was, how we all loved him, how he and I would have been lifelong friends. I hurried away from her because my mouth was shaking and my voice was freezing up. But first I told Mrs. Tierney that I was going to carry John's memorial card in my helmet for my career, and to this day, I still have it there. I look at that card in my helmet, the plastic edges melted and curled, but John's face still as clear as ever. All these years later, it can still catch me off guard. I see his face and I remember the living John, and sadness tightens my throat. On New Year's Eve, I was in a bar with my roommate, my closest friend since high school, drinking more than I should, which was too common at that time. We were watching a Kiss cover band performing in full makeup, a great New Year's Eve show. When the band left the stage, a pause before their encore, I rushed through the crowd, onto the stage, and up to the lead singer's microphone. The band was waving at me from the side where the crowd couldn't see, trying to get me off the stage, but I took the microphone, raised my beer, and yelled, "Here's to John Tierney." I jumped down from the stage and toward my friend, who I could hear shouting, "Raise your glass, he's a fireman." But to the crowd, I was just some asshole storming the stage and shouting a name no one there had heard of. From December through February, I was hardly at the World Trade Center site. You couldn't get in anymore if you weren't on duty, and my company had such a low manpower roster that we rarely sent anyone down. Then we were told to provide one firefighter to be detailed to the site for the month of March. I volunteered, and for that month, every time I went to work, I drove to downtown Manhattan and parked my car in a designated area just outside of Ground Zero. I would go through a checkpoint and be in that gray place, everything the same gray color. I was in a group with one lieutenant and 4 firemen, and for that month, we would go back and forth with rakes and shovels, picking through the remaining debris that made up the pit, or sifting through buckets full of debris that the excavation machinery dug out and laid aside, or raking through fields of the debris that was brought from the pit by the truckload to be spread out for a final on-site check before being taken to the Staten Island garbage dump, where it would be searched one last time. We were sifting through one of these final check truckloads when someone pulled up a piece of his skull. He put it in a bag to be taken for DNA testing. Then someone found another piece of his skull, and then another, and more, until we realized we were digging at landfill, and these pieces of skull were actually broken clamshells. To us at the time, this was funny. There was a portion of the crushed World Trade Center in the southeast corner that was being used as a road for construction vehicles to drive in and out of the pit. Then in early March, a metal ramp was assembled from Liberty Street down to the bedrock. That southeast corner of Ground Zero was one of the last areas to be searched, and because of this, March yielded the most human remains since early in the recovery effort. The burnt concrete smell of Ground Zero was a constant, but when your nose picked up the pungent smell of death, you knew a body was being exposed somewhere. I remember standing on the pile of debris in the southeast corner, distracted by that smell of death. I was sweeping my eyes across the debris, staring at the crushed concrete and twisted metal, looking for human remains and not paying attention at all to the swing of an excavator's boom that was directly next to me. At the last second, I saw it and ducked, barely avoiding having my head cracked. And then I spotted the source of the smell that had held me so transfixed. Next to the excavator was a flag-covered body already lying in a basket. It was the remains of a fireman. The work stopped when members from the recovered firefighters company arrived at the site to carry his body out of that hole in the ground. Firemen and cops lined the ramp, saluting in silence as the body came past. That was how it was every time a first responder's body came out. Work would stop and his exit would pass a line of silently saluting firemen and police. There was animosity between the different services, misplaced anger. I can remember seeing Port Authority cops in hard hats that said WAT 37. I found out that this meant, what about the 37, which was the number of Port Authority cops who died on September 11th. I saw some NYPD hard hats with similar messages for the 23 they lost. Did they perceive that the fire department's loss of 343 members was getting all the attention and their losses were being forgotten? What about the staggering number of civilians lost from Cantor Fitzgerald alone? There were so many lost lives, and any animosity between cops and firemen was stupidly misplaced. I can remember seeing graffiti on the walls in the porta-johns questioning our reasons for being there. Firemen accused of stealing from the site. Police accused of being there only for the overtime money. I can remember lining the ramp as a fireman's body was brought out, standing in silent salute as he was carried past, and immediately afterwards seeing 2 enraged firemen march to the southeast corner of the pit. Although I had no idea what was going on, I followed, along with everyone else in the lineup. The 2 enraged firemen climbed onto the pile of debris and started shouting at a pair of cops who had refused to stop working when the body was brought out. All 4 stood on the hill of debris, screaming furiously back and forth, and then the wrecking ball fist of one of the strongest firemen I know cocked back as if to strike. I couldn't believe it. At that moment, several police cars came racing down the ramp, lights and sirens going, and thankfully the fist never flew. The refusal to join the lineup and the confrontation that followed was all a part of that misplaced anger in the midst of this ongoing horrible event. On a gray hill of crushed and compacted wreckage that sloped up the northwest corner of the pit, we spotted a difference in color that could only be skin. We went to work digging at the area around it, cutting back what we couldn't lift away until we were able to free the body. But it wasn't a body. It was a papery, twisted wrapping of bones that had once been two people, now so entwined and flattened together that it would have been impossible to pull them apart. When we had these people completely freed from the hill, I was the one in the position to lift them into the bag. I can remember being amazed by how little they weighed, this twisted mass that had once been two human beings. Another time on that same slope, I found a toe. It had somehow become petrified, a fossil of a toe, and I can remember holding it in my hand, looking at it, turning it over, trying to decide what to do. Without a doubt, it was a toe, but it had become like a rock, like a piece of a statue, and for some reason my head couldn't wrap around this. Was it a toe? Of course it was. I was holding it, staring at it, a single toe, hardened like a rock. But something was keeping me from putting it into a bag, sending it to the morgue, having it cataloged. My mind was a mess. I held that toe, continued not knowing what to do. Drop it back onto the debris and hope someone else would find it, put it in a bag and send it to the morgue. Why was I wondering? Why was there any question at all? I held that toe for a long time, afraid to drop it, afraid to hand it in, lost in my strange uncertainty. There were so many bones and body pieces getting bagged down there, but for some reason this one solitary toe had me completely stunned. Then finally I saw another body part being bagged nearby, and feeling like a sneak, I went over and dropped the toe into the bag with those remains. I still wonder sometimes what it was about that single toe that paralyzed my mind. One day in March, we unearthed a set of crumbled, twisted bunker gear from the densely packed rubble. There were bones scattered through it. I remember ribs, not much else. As with any time there was evidence that we were digging out a fireman's body, we tried to determine an identity before putting every possible piece of him into a body bag to be placed in a basket and covered by an American flag. When the bunker pants were untwisted from the debris, I saw underpants inside, and my mind went back to childhood, remembering how mothers would write their kids' names in the waistbands of their underpants for camp or whatever. My jumbled mind, more off than I could admit, got the idea that this adult fireman might have written his own name in his own underpants. So I looked inside for a name on the waistband, and I saw a bunch of pubic hair. It turned my blood ice cold. It's strange how such an unexpected thing can have so crippling an effect. The sight of that pubic hair terrified me, haunted me, messed me up worse, I think, than anything else I had seen. I remember getting home that evening to my apartment in Long Island City and walking to the bar to get a pizza for dinner, and I couldn't shake the image. I couldn't get it out of my mind. And while I waited for my pizza, I ordered beer after beer, drinking them down as fast as they arrived. But that simple, horrible sight wouldn't leave my head. It wouldn't disappear. I'd drink a beer, I'd close my eyes, I'd see that bunch of pubic hair. It gave me fucking nightmares, that bunch of pubic hair in some poor soul's underpants. Not long after that, the recovery effort was over, though incomplete. No trace was ever found of so many of those missing people. Human beings lost right there, gone, vanished, with nothing left to search. Just an empty man-made canyon down to the bedrock where once these massive buildings had stood. Never forget. Thank you, guys.